The buzz of the open 24 hours sign above the door echoed in the quiet parking lot. I took a deep breath, staring at the small grocery store in front of me. This wasn't my ideal job, not by a long shot, but after losing my office job due to the company's bankruptcy last month, I didn't have many options. Tonight was my first night shift here, and I had no idea what to expect. The pay was decent enough to keep me afloat until something better came along. I could manage. The automatic doors swished open as I approached, and I stepped inside, greeted by the smell of disinfectant and faintly stale air. The store was practically empty. No surprise for a Tuesday night. And behind the counter stood my new manager, Mr. Bryan. He looked older than I expected, maybe in his late 50s, with gray hair and eyes that seemed to pierce right through you.
You must be Grace.
He said, his voice deep and serious. That's me, I said, offering him a polite smile.
I'm Mr. Bryan.
He replied, extending a hand. I shook it, and his grip was cold, almost too cold. He seemed to study me for a moment before speaking again.
All right, so here's the deal. This is your first night shift, and there are a few important rules you need to follow. They are non-negotiable.
Rules? I repeated, surprised. Mr. Bryan didn't smile.
Yes, I know it sounds odd, but trust me, these are important. They keep us safe. We do not get a lot of foot traffic at night, but that doesn't mean we're safe. Not here.
I raised an eyebrow. This sounded like one of those overly serious things that some managers like to do to make their jobs seem more important. He handed me a laminated card with 5 rules written in bold block letters. 1. Keep the freezer door locked at all times. 2. Watch the security cameras every hour for at least 10 minutes and take note of any areas to avoid. 3. If you hear knocking from the back room, do not respond or investigate. 4. Leave the front doors unlocked until 2 a.m., but lock them promptly at 2:01 a.m. 5. No matter what happens, do not go into aisle 7 after midnight. I blinked at the list, confused. Aisle 7? And why exactly would I?
Don't ask why. Just follow the rules. It's for your safety, Grace. I can't explain it all, but I promise you, if you break them, bad things will happen.
I nodded, not sure what to say. It all sounded a little extreme for a grocery store, but I wasn't going to argue. I just needed to keep my head down and get through the night. All right, I said, trying to sound confident. Got it. I'll follow the rules.
Good. I'll be back to check on you around 7 a.m. Don't try to leave early. And don't forget, if something happens that you don't understand, just stick to the rules. It'll keep you safe.
I couldn't tell if he was being sincere or if he was just a weird guy with a strange obsession with rules. Either way, I didn't have time to dwell on it. Mr. Bryan walked away, leaving me alone in the dimly lit store. The buzz of the fluorescent lights above me seemed louder now, and I felt a bit of unease creeping up my spine. But I shoved it aside. I had work to do. I checked the time. My shift had officially started, and the store needed stocking. With a deep breath, I grabbed a cart and began pushing it down the aisles. I tried to shake off the odd feeling of being watched, telling myself it was just my nerves. But, as I passed aisle 7, I couldn't help but glance down it. There was nothing unusual there, just rows of canned goods. But a shiver ran down my spine anyway. I moved on quickly, trying to focus on the job at hand. I didn't want to think about the rules. I didn't want to think about why Mr. Bryan had sounded so serious. I just wanted to get through the night. But the rules were there, hanging over me like a dark cloud. And somehow, I knew they weren't something I could ignore. The aisles stretched out before me, quiet and empty, as I began to stock the shelves. The rhythmic sound of my footsteps on the tile floor echoed through the store, and for a moment I convinced myself that the unease I felt was just a result of the weirdness of the night shift. I kept glancing at the clock. It wasn't even midnight yet, and I had a few hours before things got really quiet. That was when the store's strange rules seemed most important, when I'd have to rely on them the most. I hadn't gone near aisle 7 since Mr. Bryan's warning, and the more I thought about it, the more I was convinced he had to be messing with me. Aisle 7? Really? I grabbed a case of cereal boxes and wheeled my cart toward the back of the store. Everything seemed normal, aside from the occasional flicker of the overhead lights. I tried to ignore them, but they kept doing it. Blink, blink, blink. Maybe the old wiring was the issue. That was the most logical explanation, right? I'd worked in old buildings before, and this felt the same. Just a bit of wear and tear. But when the lights flickered again, I couldn't help but feel a little jump in my chest. This time, it didn't feel like just a minor electrical problem. The store seemed off. The air felt heavier, and a strange chill was creeping in, especially near the freezer section. I moved quickly, trying not to dwell on it. The freezer needed to be stocked, and I had to remember the first rule: keep the freezer door locked at all times. It was odd, really. The freezer doors had been locked when I started, but why did it need to be locked all the time? What could possibly be inside? I pushed the thought away and grabbed a crate of frozen vegetables, sliding it into place. Then, just as I was about to finish up, I heard a faint knocking sound. At first, I thought it was the freezer door banging against its frame. But when it came again, more insistent, almost rhythmic, I froze. Knocking. From the back room. My heart skipped. Mr. Bryan's voice echoed in my mind, clear as day.
If you hear knocking from the back room, do not respond or investigate.
I swallowed hard and gripped the edge of the freezer, trying to steady my breathing. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate, like someone was tapping a finger on a wall, just soft enough to make me doubt whether it was real. Maybe it was the wind? I tried to convince myself that was the case, but the sound didn't stop. I glanced at the clock. It was a little after midnight now. I couldn't ignore it. But I also couldn't go check it out. The rules had been clear. Do not investigate. I turned back to the freezer and pushed the door shut with a little more force than necessary. The knocking continued, but I refused to look toward the back room. My hands were trembling as I forced myself to focus on the task in front of me. The store felt colder. I quickly finished stocking the freezer and moved on, trying to shake the unease from my chest. I glanced around the aisles, every corner feeling just a little too dark, a little too quiet. The flickering of the lights didn't help. The shadowed edges of the store seemed to stretch out into the unknown, as though the walls themselves were closing in on me. That's when I heard it again. The knocking. This time, it was louder, sharper, and it wasn't coming from the back room anymore. It was closer, like someone was standing just behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. My eyes darted to the camera monitors in the corner of the store, just past the self-checkout area. I remembered what Mr. Bryan had said.
Watch the security cameras every hour for at least 10 minutes, and take note of any areas to avoid.
I needed to check them. I had to be sure. I walked quickly to the office, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the silence. As I sat down in front of the monitors, I felt the cold rush in again, this time curling up my spine. I checked the cameras, my eyes scanning each aisle methodically. Everything seemed fine. But then, on the screen showing aisle 7, I saw something. A dark figure. It was just standing there, motionless, its shape barely discernible in the flickering light, but unmistakable. The figure was tall, slender, almost unnatural. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, but when I looked again, it was gone. My breath caught in my throat. What was that? I glanced around the office, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that it was just the shadows playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the image of the figure from my mind. A part of me wanted to go back to the freezer, check the back room. But another part, the part that had heard Mr. Bryan's voice in my head, reminded me of the rules.
Do not investigate.
I leaned back in the chair, heart pounding, staring at the camera feed. The rest of the store appeared empty. No strange figures lurking in any other aisles. But I knew that whatever was in aisle 7 was real, and I had a sinking feeling that the rest of the night wasn't going to be as quiet as it had started. The image of the dark figure in aisle 7 haunted me as I sat in the office, staring at the security monitors. I couldn't shake the sense of dread that clung to the air, thick and suffocating. The room felt colder, despite the fact that the heater had been running fine all evening. I checked the cameras again, but there was no sign of anything unusual. Aisle 7 was completely empty now, the shelves standing undisturbed under the harsh light. But I knew what I'd seen. The knocks from the back room had stopped, but my mind raced, replaying the sound in my head. I kept thinking about Mr. Bryan's rules. Do not investigate. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing, just my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 1 a.m. I had an hour left before I could lock the front doors, just like Mr. Bryan said. The pressure in my chest felt like it was building, and I was suddenly hyper-aware of every creak and groan of the store. The air around me felt too still. I shook my head, trying to focus. The knocks hadn't come back. The figure hadn't returned. Maybe it was just the isolation of the night shift messing with me. I needed to get to work. I grabbed a few boxes of cleaning supplies and started heading down the aisles, forcing myself to ignore the nagging feeling in my gut. As I passed aisle 7, my heart skipped. I couldn't help it. I turned my head, my eyes scanning the empty shelves. The lights flickered again, just for a moment, but this time, I thought I saw something in the corner of my eye. A movement too quick to register. I stopped dead in my tracks. No one was there. The aisle was still empty. But I could feel it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had to force myself to keep moving. Focus, Grace. It's just your imagination. I kept walking, pushing the cart past aisle 7, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I picked up the pace, my footsteps becoming louder, more hurried as I made my way toward the cleaning section. But the faster I moved, the more I felt like I was being followed. Suddenly a loud bang echoed through the store. I whipped around, heart pounding. The noise had come from the back room, followed by that same rhythmic knocking. I froze. The knocking was softer now, almost casual, as if whoever or whatever was doing it knew I was listening. But there was something different about it this time. It wasn't just a knock on the wall anymore. It was the sound of scratching, slow, deliberate, like nails dragging along concrete. My pulse hammered in my ears as I backed up toward the office. I knew I wasn't supposed to investigate, but the sound felt wrong. Too close, too real. I reached the office door and grabbed the handle, yanking it open. The lights flickered once more as I stepped inside, but this time they stayed dim. The monitors were showing the same view of the store, the aisles empty and still, but the scratching sound in the back room had stopped. I sat down at the desk, breathing heavily, trying to calm my racing heart. My eyes scanned the monitors, checking the cameras again, making sure I wasn't missing anything, but aisle 7 was still empty. The back room? Nothing. Just the dark corners of the store, still as ever. I tried to focus on the task at hand, watching the cameras, staying on top of my shift, but the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, gnawed at me. Every so often, I thought I saw a shadow dart across the screen, moving too quickly to be caught. Every creak of the building felt amplified in my ears. I was so distracted by the eerie atmosphere that I didn't hear the noise at first. A soft thud came from the freezer section. I whipped my head toward the monitor, but nothing had changed. Still the same frozen food section, still nothing moving. I stood up slowly and grabbed my flashlight, heading back to the freezer with a mix of dread and curiosity. As I approached the frozen aisle, I heard it again. The faint thud. Like something had dropped or something was inside. I knew the rule. I had to check. I had to make sure the freezer door was locked. I could hear the faint hum of the freezer motor, but beneath it, there was something else. A low scraping sound coming from inside the unit. I swallowed hard, holding the flashlight in a death grip. I tried to ignore the rising panic in my chest. I wasn't going to open it, of course. I wasn't that stupid. I just had to make sure it was still locked. But when I approached the door, I stopped cold. It was open. The freezer door was slightly ajar. I could feel the cold air leaking out, and the scraping sound grew louder, more frantic. I stared at the door, my mind racing, but my body couldn't move. The rules were clear. Keep the freezer locked at all times. I knew I hadn't left it open, and I hadn't heard anything that suggested it was tampered with. But here it was, cracked open just enough for the cold to seep out. My hands shook as I slowly approached, my flashlight casting long shadows on the floor. I held my breath and grabbed the door handle, pulling it open just a crack. The light from the flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw something. Something moving inside. A shadow shifted, just out of sight. Then it stopped. I slammed the door shut without a second thought, locking it tightly. The scraping stopped instantly, and the cold air seemed to vanish with it. I stood there, panting, my heart in my throat. What the hell was that? I quickly backed away from the freezer, breathing shallowly, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. The knocking had started again. Louder now. Closer. I ran to the office and slammed the door behind me, locking it as I stumbled to the desk, frantically checking the monitors. I couldn't go near the freezer again. I couldn't go anywhere near the back room. The knocking echoed through the store. And then, just as I turned to glance at the camera feed for aisle 7, I saw something else. Something that made my blood run cold. A figure. It was standing in aisle 7. I couldn't breathe. The figure in aisle 7 stood perfectly still, motionless in the flickering light. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and my hand trembled as I gripped the edge of the desk, trying to steady myself. It was like my entire body was frozen, caught in a trance. I blinked, hoping the image would disappear, but it didn't. The figure remained, tall and thin, its shape barely discernible in the darkened aisle. The lights above me flickered again, casting erratic shadows across the room. I quickly glanced at the camera feed. Nothing had changed on the screen. Aisle 7 looked just like it always did, except I could still see it. The figure standing there in my mind, perfectly clear. Focus, Grace. I told myself, trying to control my breathing, but my legs were like lead, unable to move. I couldn't go back to the freezer, I couldn't leave the office, and I certainly couldn't check the aisle. My mind kept racing. It's the rules. Don't go near aisle 7. Don't investigate. I felt trapped. I had to stay put. I turned my attention back to the camera monitor. But now, every second that passed felt like a lifetime. The figure hadn't moved. It was almost like it was waiting for me to do something, to react. Then the knocking started again. It was coming from the back room. The sound was relentless now, hard, loud, unmistakable. It echoed through the store like a drumbeat, vibrating in my bones. My stomach churned, and I instinctively glanced toward the office door, as if something might come creeping in at any moment. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the urge to run, but my feet were already moving. I stood up and hurried to the door, locking it behind me, even though I wasn't sure what good it would do. There was no escaping the store, no escaping whatever was inside it. I just need to follow the rules. That was the only thing that kept me grounded. I couldn't go into aisle 7. I couldn't investigate the knocking. I needed to wait. I needed to stay safe. I walked back toward the monitors, my mind racing. Each breath felt too loud, too frantic, as I tried to focus on the screens. But the store felt too quiet now. The knocking had stopped, but the tension in the air had only grown thicker. And then I saw it. In the corner of the monitor, just behind the shelves in aisle 7, a shadow moved. I flinched and backed away from the screen, my chest tight with panic. There was no mistaking it. The shadow had definitely moved. The figure wasn't static anymore. It had shifted, as if something was coming closer, creeping toward the camera. My mind screamed at me to turn the monitor off, to shut my eyes and pretend none of it was happening, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, unable to look away. The shadow continued to grow larger. It's in the aisle. It's coming closer. I grabbed the card with the rules, pressing it against my chest like some kind of shield. I needed to follow the rules. I had to. The knocking from the back room resumed, louder and faster, almost rhythmic. But the real horror wasn't the knocking or the shadows. It was the feeling, the sense that I was being hunted. I spun around, my hand flying to the door handle as I quickly scanned the office. The back room wasn't visible from here, but the closer I got to the door, the more I felt something pressing in from behind me. Something watching, waiting. I stopped dead in my tracks when I heard something behind me. A soft scrape, like a finger dragging across glass. I slowly turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. There was nothing behind me. I exhaled shakily, feeling foolish. My nerves were getting the best of me. I was fine. Everything was fine. But then I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of a footstep. It came from somewhere close. It was too real, too present to be ignored. My body tensed, every muscle screaming for me to move, to leave. But I remembered the rules again. The one Mr. Bryan had stressed so much. Do not leave the office until 2 a.m. The floor creaked. The air felt thick with dread. I stared at the monitors, barely able to make sense of what I was seeing. Aisle 7. The figure was now standing right in front of the camera. Its shape was more distinct now, tall, skeletal, the edges of its form flickering like a bad signal. I couldn't make out its features, but its presence was undeniable. It was alive, even though I wasn't sure if it was human. Suddenly, the lights overhead flickered violently, plunging the store into near darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively took a step back, my hand flying to the office door again. But as I turned toward the door, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of nails scraping across the glass of the office window. I froze. There was someone outside the door, or something. I couldn't tell where the noise was coming from, but it sounded too close, too real. Then, the lights returned, casting the store in a harsh, unnatural light. And I saw it. The figure wasn't in aisle 7 anymore. It was standing right in front of the office window. It was so close I could see the faint outlines of its face. Pale, almost rotting, its eyes black holes that seemed to stare directly into mine. I stumbled back, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I slammed my back against the wall. My mind was screaming, but no sound came out of my mouth. I knew I had to do something. But my body refused to obey. I just kept staring at the window, frozen, terrified, as the figure on the other side of the glass raised its hands slowly, almost deliberately, and with one long, clawed finger, it tapped on the glass. The tapping on the glass sent a jolt of icy fear through me, freezing me to the spot. The figure on the other side was still, its black eyes boring into mine as it slowly, deliberately, tapped on the glass with one long, clawed finger. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just stood there, staring at it, my heart hammering so loudly I thought it would burst from my chest. Every cell in my body screamed to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. The only thing that kept me grounded was the memory of Mr. Bryan's rules. Follow the rules. Stay inside the office. Don't go near the freezer. I glanced at the clock. It was 1:45 a.m. The front door wasn't supposed to be locked until 2 a.m. But the sight of the thing outside the window made me reconsider everything I thought I knew about the rules. Was I even safe here anymore? The rules hadn't helped me so far. In fact, they seemed to be the only thing that had kept me in this nightmare, forcing me to follow every instruction like a prisoner to some unseen force. I forced myself to take a step back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure didn't move. It was still there, staring at me, its finger never stopping its slow, rhythmic tap against the glass. I could hear it clearly now, tap, 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 like a countdown. You can't stay in here forever. The thought cut through my mind like a knife. If I didn't do something, if I didn't follow the rules and leave at 2 a.m. when I was supposed to, I was going to be trapped. Trapped in here with that thing, with whatever it was. I glanced around the office. The lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows on the walls. My mind raced as I tried to think of anything that could help me, any way out of this. The rules were clear. I had to follow them. The door, the front door. I could leave when the clock struck 2. But until then, I had to stay here. The cold dread was crawling up my spine, but I forced myself to calm down. I had an hour to survive. The tapping on the glass grew louder, faster, more frantic. Tap, 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 tap. It was like it was counting down, like it knew the exact moment I could leave. My pulse pounded in my ears and I fought the urge to sprint out of the office and away from that thing, but I held my ground. The rules. Stay in the office, watch the cameras, do not leave. The knocking from the back room started up again. It was louder now, as if something or someone was trying to break through from the other side. The scratching had returned too, just like before. My nerves were stretched so thin that every little sound felt like a bomb going off in my head. I kept my eyes on the cameras. Every second felt like an eternity as I waited for the clock to hit 2 a.m. The thing outside the window stopped tapping. But it didn't leave. Instead, it just stood there, its eyes unblinking, watching. I couldn't escape its gaze. I felt like it could see everything, every thought, every fear I had. Follow the rules. Stay in the office. I repeated the words in my head, as if saying them out loud might give me the strength to resist the urge to run. I couldn't let fear control me. I had to survive this. The lights flickered again, and this time, the store went completely dark. I jumped, my pulse skyrocketing, as I reached for the desk, trying to find some sense of stability in the pitch-black room. The air was cold, almost freezing, and I could feel the temperature dropping rapidly, like the store had suddenly been plunged into winter. I reached for the flashlight on the desk, but just as I turned it on, the lights flickered back to life. But now, something was different. The store looked wrong. The aisles were no longer lined with shelves full of products. They were empty, barren. The shadows between the aisles seemed deeper, darker. I turned back to the window. The figure was still there. But now, it wasn't tapping anymore. It was smiling. I stumbled back, gasping in horror. It was a twisted grin, something far too wide for any human to make. The thing on the other side of the glass seemed to delight in my terror, its smile stretching impossibly, its black eyes gleaming with malice. I had no idea how I was still standing, how my legs hadn't given way under the weight of what I was seeing. But I couldn't look away. The figure was right there. The knocking resumed, but this time, it was different. It was louder, more desperate, as though whatever was behind the back room door was trying to break through. I looked at the clock again. 1:55 a.m. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, every tick of the clock louder than the last. The figure's smile widened even further, stretching to an impossible extent. I felt sick, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It reached toward the window, placing its hand flat against the glass, and I felt it. The coldness, the pressure, the pull, it was as though it were right there, on the other side, just waiting for me to open the door, waiting for me to make the wrong move. Just survive. Just wait. The minutes ticked by like hours. The knocking in the back room became even more frantic. I felt the weight of every second pressing down on me. 2 a.m. is almost here. I wiped the sweat off my brow, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The rules, follow the rules. I couldn't let them slip away. I turned toward the door again, glancing at the clock. 1:58. I could make it. I just had to wait. And then, at the stroke of 2 a.m., I slammed my hand down on the lock, throwing open the door, feeling a strange surge of relief flood through me. The moment I stepped out of the office, the store was silent. Everything was still. The knocking, the scratching, the figure outside the window, it was all gone. I stood there for a second, frozen in the quiet. The eerie feeling still clung to the air, but it was as if the store had somehow gone back to normal. No monsters, no shadows. Nothing but the faint hum of the lights above me. I let out a shaky breath, heart still pounding in my chest. I had made it. I had survived. I slowly turned toward the front door, my hands shaking as I approached. My fingers fumbled around the handle, but when I opened it, I felt nothing. The outside world was waiting for me. But whatever I had just survived in there, whatever had stalked the aisles, was still locked behind those doors. And I had no idea if I would ever have to go back. I stood at the entrance of the grocery store, my breath coming in ragged, shaky gasps as I looked back at the doors. The world outside felt too quiet, too normal, compared to the horror that had unfolded inside. I stepped forward, pushing the heavy glass door open. The cool night air hit me, a sharp contrast to the oppressive cold I'd just escaped. My body felt numb, like I was moving through water, every step heavy, as if the store's sinister presence had somehow followed me. I had made it. But the relief was fleeting. The streets were still and empty, the lights of the nearby street lamps casting long shadows across the pavement. It looked like any other late-night walk home from work. I kept telling myself I was free, but every instinct in my body screamed that I wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to turn back. I turned my head, looking at the store one last time. The front doors stood wide open, an eerie invitation. But as I gazed at them, I realized something. The sign above the entrance, open 24 hours, flickered, the letters distorting as if they were trying to reshape themselves. My stomach turned. There was no logical reason for it. The store had closed. I was outside. Yet somehow, the store wasn't done with me. A cold breeze blew across my neck, sending a chill down my spine. I looked away, forcing myself to take another step. But just as I turned, a thought stopped me cold. The rules. Mr. Bryan's rules. I had followed them to the letter. But what if there was one last rule that I hadn't been told? What if... I stopped dead in my tracks. What if I was never supposed to leave? What if the moment I stepped outside, I triggered something worse than what I had already survived? What if I had escaped, only to bring the danger with me? I didn't even realize my feet had moved until I was already walking back toward the store. My mind screamed for me to stop, but my body was acting on its own, drawn back like a magnet. Don't go back. Don't go near it. The moment I stepped back through the door, I felt it. The air shifted again, a sudden weight pressing down on me, heavy and suffocating. My legs wobbled, and I stumbled a bit before catching myself. The lights inside flickered once more, casting distorted shadows. But this time, something was different. The aisles, once barren, were full again, full of strange, unfamiliar products, with eerie labels that I didn't recognize. The shelves were piled high, almost to the ceiling, and the store felt larger. The knocking from the back room started up again, but this time, it wasn't a random sound. It was deliberate. Meant for me. Every knock seemed to beckon me, drawing me deeper into the store. I turned toward the back room, instinctively wanting to run the other way, but my feet stayed rooted to the spot. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever Mr. Bryan had meant by the rules was now clear. They hadn't been just a way to keep me safe. They had been a way to keep me trapped. I could feel my pulse racing, every fiber of my being screaming to get out, but the knocking was growing louder, more urgent. I had to do something. I couldn't be caught again. I forced my legs to move, walking toward the back room, every step feeling heavier than the last. The store seemed to shift around me, the shelves and aisles twisting, distorting. Everything felt wrong. The lights flickered again, casting long, twisted shadows that didn't quite match up with the layout of the store. And then I saw it. The backroom door was open, the same one I had heard the knocking from, the same one I had avoided for so long. It loomed in front of me like a dark portal, its edges ragged, as though it had been torn open. I stood at the threshold, my body trembling, knowing that whatever waited behind it would be far worse than anything I'd seen. But as my hand hovered over the doorknob, I realized the last rule had never been spoken aloud. The final rule wasn't one Mr. Bryan had told me to follow. It wasn't even one I had considered. It was the one rule that had been with me the entire time. Don't look back. I understood it now. I had been drawn back to the store, pulled into the darkness by my fear, by the need to understand what had happened. But now, as I stared into the blackness of the back room, I knew that I couldn't stay here. There was no escaping it. Whatever I had gone through, the figure, the knocking, the twisted rules, it wasn't over. I hadn't just survived the night. I had become part of it. Part of the store. I wasn't supposed to come back. I wasn't supposed to make it out. With a final desperate breath, I stepped away from the door and turned my back on the darkness. The store was still there, its cold, oppressive presence lurking in the corners of my mind, but I refused to acknowledge it. I didn't look back as I walked out the door again, back into the quiet night. But as I stepped into the street, I swore I could still hear the faintest knocking echoing behind me, and I knew that one day I would return.